On a snowy evening, the old church bells rang for joy as Ethan slipped the ring onto Clara's trembling hand. But before their vows could echo through the holy hall, the doors crashed open. Masked men stormed in, chains rattled, and laughter turned to screams. The bride and groom, bound in their own sanctuary, saw their perfect day twisted into a ransom nightmare. Hope flickered low, until a German shepherd's thunderous bark shattered the silence, and an officer stepped from the storm. What came next was not just a rescue. It was a testament that love can outshine fear, and that angels sometimes walk beside us on 4 legs. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The small town of Coldridge, Washington, sat under a heavy curtain of winter that morning, as if nature itself wished to shroud every celebration in white silence. The town was known for its lumber mills and its long, unforgiving winters, where snow piled higher than fences and winds whipped through the pine trees like the howls of ghosts. The streets leading toward the outskirts were nearly abandoned, muffled under fresh snow, but at the far end of a narrow lane, an old stone church stood proudly, its stained glass windows glimmering faintly in the pale light. The church was older than memory, its Gothic spires blackened by years of storms, yet still it held an air of sanctity and endurance. Inside, warmth radiated from the many candles placed along wooden pews, their flames trembling as if in anticipation. This was where Ethan and Clara had chosen to speak their vows, away from the chaos of city life, among only those they trusted most. Ethan was a tall man in his early 30s, his frame broad and powerful, a body that bore the subtle marks of years spent working in construction. His jaw was square, his cheekbones sharp, and the faint stubble on his chin gave him a rugged handsomeness that matched the sincerity of his dark brown eyes. His hair was cut short, black streaked lightly by stress and sleepless nights. Though he looked like a man who had weathered storms of his own, there was a gentleness in the way he glanced toward Clara, as though all the weight of his life had been worth carrying to arrive at this moment. Clara, the bride, was slender and elegant, standing beside him like a figure carved from porcelain. She was 28, with long chestnut-brown hair cascading in waves down her back, and her veil shimmered in the glow of the stained glass above. Her skin was pale, soft against the lace of her gown, and her blue eyes reflected a mixture of nervousness and joy. She had always been known in town as a quiet yet determined woman, someone who bore life's hardships with silent grace. Today her cheeks were flushed with hope, her lips trembling into a smile every time she glanced at Ethan's strong hand holding hers. Around them sat only a small gathering. Friends and family, perhaps 20 at most, dressed in muted coats and scarves, for the church itself was cold despite the candles. Among them was David, Ethan's oldest friend from high school, a man with sandy hair and a laugh that once echoed in every bar of the town before marriage and fatherhood softened him into a devoted father. He sat near the front with his wife, holding her hand, whispering words of admiration at the bride. Further back sat Aunt Margaret, Clara's only surviving relative, a woman in her late 60s, thin and bird-like, with silver-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had raised Clara after her parents passed away in a car accident when she was only 10, and she had come today with tears brimming in her eyes, proud to see the girl she, once held through nightmares, now standing tall as a bride. The priest, Father Joseph, stood at the altar, a man in his 50s with a solemn face lined by years of service and compassion. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the church with the opening words of blessing. Outside, the wind howled, pushing against the stained glass windows, but inside, It seemed for a moment as though nothing could disturb this sanctuary of vows and sacred promises. The bells began to toll, marking the hour. Clara squeezed Ethan's hand tighter, her veil trembling slightly with the weight of emotion. Just as Father Joseph raised his hand to invite them to speak their vows, the heavy wooden doors of the church slammed open with a violent crash. The sound echoed like thunder through the sanctuary, scattering the fragile warmth. Snow swirled in through the open doors, carried on a gust of bitter wind, and in its wake came 4 men, their faces obscured by dark masks, their heavy boots striking hard against the old stone floor. Each man carried a weapon, one with a long hunting rifle slung across his chest, another with a pistol gleaming in his gloved hand, the others gripping thick coils of rope. Their presence was as sudden as a nightmare breaking into daylight. For a moment, the guests froze, their gasps echoing against the high arches of the church ceiling. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her fingers clutching Ethan's desperately. The leader of the intruders, a tall man with broad shoulders and a scar slicing across his cheek, visible even beneath his mask, barked an order. His voice was rough, gravelly, as though it had been carved out of years of shouting commands. "On the ground, all of you, now!" His eyes were hard, black, filled with a coldness that had no place in a sacred hall. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, some dropping to their knees, others frozen in shock. David tried to stand, his instincts to protect his friends stronger than his fear, but a pistol swung in his direction made him freeze. Aunt Margaret clutched her rosary, her lips trembling in silent prayer, as 2 of the masked men rushed forward, pushing people down, yanking Ethan and Clara away from the altar. Ethan struggled, his jaw clenched, but the rifle pressed against his temple forced him still. Clara's veil was ripped aside, her cry muffled as rough hands bound her wrists tightly with coarse rope. The intruders moved swiftly, efficiently, as though this had been planned for weeks. Within minutes, every guest was forced to the ground, hands tied behind their backs. Father Joseph was shoved aside, his cassock stained with dust from the stone floor. The priest's solemn eyes widened with horror, yet he remained silent, his voice lost in the fear that smothered the air. Ethan and Clara, still in their wedding attire, were thrown down beside one another near the altar, their wrists bound, their mouths gagged with strips of cloth torn from the pew's upholstery. The bride's white gown dragged across the cold stone floor, its lace stained with dirt, a cruel twist of fate marking the day meant to be her most cherished. The leader of the masked men paced before them, his breath heavy in the cold air of the church. He looked at Ethan and Clara as though they were trophies, then leaned closer, his scarred face only inches away. "Your family will pay dearly for this union," he hissed, his words dripping with venom. Behind him, his men shoved the remaining guests together, their muffled sobs filling the silence between the tolling of the bells. The sacred church, once filled with hope and light, had been twisted into a prison of fear. Ethan turned his head toward Clara, their eyes locking despite the ropes and gags. His gaze spoke what his mouth could not. "Hold on. We will survive this." But Clara's tears streamed down her pale cheeks, her chest rising and falling in sharp breaths, her heart pounding against the ropes that cut into her wrists. In that moment, the dream of their wedding day crumbled, replaced by the cruel reality of captivity. As the leader barked orders to his men, demanding silence and obedience, the candles flickered violently, shadows stretching long across the stone walls. Outside, the storm raged louder, the wind howling through the empty streets of Coldridge. No one in the town knew that within the church, under the tolling bells and trembling glass, a bride and groom were bound in terror. The nightmare had only just begun. The church that had once been filled with hymns and promises now echoed with a silence weighted by fear. The masked men moved like shadows, their boots scraping against the ancient stones as they tightened the ropes around the wrists of the guests and shoved them closer together at the base of the altar. Candlelight flickered on the stained glass above, throwing fractured colors onto terrified faces. Yet instead of beauty, it created a macabre theater. The red glow resembling blood, the blues like ice that seeped into bone. Clara lay bound beside Ethan, her gown pooling across the cold floor, her breath shallow behind the gag. Ethan's eyes, though restrained, burned with fury, muscles straining against the coarse rope. But he was powerless, at least for now. The leader of the intruders straightened, towering above them. He was a broad man with a scar etched across his left cheek, visible even beneath the rough black cloth of his mask. His shoulders were hunched with years of carrying weight, not only of muscle, but of bitterness. His voice cracked the silence, harsh and commanding. "Listen carefully, all of you. We didn't come here for vows or prayers. We came for what belongs to us, and today, you will pay." His words echoed off the vaulted ceiling, filling every dark corner. Among the 4 kidnappers, one stepped forward to stand beside him. This man was smaller in build, wiry, his movements jittery, like a man used to life in the shadows. When he pulled down his mask for a brief moment to breathe, the candlelight revealed a narrow face with sharp cheekbones, sunken eyes, and a mouth that twisted into a perpetual smirk. His hair was blonde, greasy, clinging to his forehead in uneven strands. His name, barked by the leader, was Mason. Unlike the scarred man whose rage seemed cold and calculated, Mason exuded the twitchy nervousness of someone unhinged. His laugh was short, brittle, and when it broke the silence, it chilled the hostages more than the threat of guns. Mason crouched near Ethan and Clara, dragging the barrel of his pistol along the stone floor until it clinked against the bride's gown. He hissed, "You thought today was your fairy tale, didn't you? But fairy tales end in blood." Clara turned her face away, squeezing her eyes shut, but Mason chuckled cruelly and stood. The scarred leader continued. "Your family's fortune is no secret, Clara Whitmore. The company your father built has been bleeding men like us dry for years, while lining your pockets with gold. We know the kind of money your family can pay to get you back alive." He spat the last word, as if life itself was a bargaining chip to be traded. Clara's heart pounded. Though she had never flaunted her family's success, she knew the business her father had expanded. A lumber company that had cut competitors out with ruthless efficiency had made enemies. Now she saw their vengeance carved into the eyes of these masked men. At the back of the church, another of the kidnappers kept watch by the door. He was tall but thin, almost skeletal, with long arms and fingers that tapped the grip of his shotgun in a steady rhythm. His posture was erect, his gaze unwavering, the mark of a man who had seen combat before. His mask slipped briefly, revealing a gaunt face with hollow cheeks, a crooked nose that had been broken more than once, and eyes that were as pale and empty as ice. His name, muttered by Mason in passing, was Reggie. Unlike Mason's instability, Reggie had the cold, measured presence of a soldier who followed orders without conscience. He stood still, unmoving, like a sentinel carved of bone. The 4th man was younger, hesitant in his movements, his hands trembling slightly as he tied the wrists of Aunt Margaret and Father Joseph. His mask sagged on one side, and when he adjusted it nervously, a youthful face emerged. Barely in his 20s, freckles still visible on his nose, and eyes that flickered with doubt rather than malice. His name, shouted angrily by the leader when he fumbled with the rope, was Kyle. His frame was lean, his back hunched as if carrying shame rather than strength. Unlike the others, Kyle's actions seemed uncertain, betraying a conscience buried beneath fear. Margaret, even bound, saw his hesitation and whispered through her gag, her old eyes catching his, silently pleading for mercy. Kyle quickly looked away, his jaw clenched, fighting some inner battle. The scarred leader, who finally identified himself as Victor, raised his voice again, pacing the length of the aisle like a preacher delivering a sermon of terror. "Here is what will happen. We will contact your family. We will demand the ransom, $10 million. If they care enough for you, they will pay. If not—" He gestured toward Mason, who grinned and drew the edge of a blade across his own palm to watch the blood bead. "If not, you all will become a warning." The guests whimpered, the sound muffled by their gags. David shook his head violently, glaring at the men, though his bonds cut into his skin. Father Joseph whispered prayers behind the cloth that silenced him, his lips forming words of hope in a place where hope seemed like a flickering candle about to die. Clara's mind spun. $10 million. Her family had wealth, yes, but they would not hand it over easily, not when they suspected enemies might lie in wait. And Victor's words about vengeance struck deep. She remembered her father's business rivalries, the contracts won through cold calculation. Perhaps this was not about ransom alone. Perhaps it was about revenge dressed in the mask of money. Mason, restless, leaned close to the bound guests, sneering. "We've been watching you. Every step of this wedding was planned. The flowers delivered, the guests arriving. Do you think we didn't know? We chose this day because joy blinds the cautious. And now, in the moment of your greatest happiness, we own you." His laughter cracked like glass in the silence. Victor silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Enough. No more games. They need to understand this is not a whim. This is justice." His scar pulled taut as he scowled. "Every man here has lost something to your family's empire. Mason lost his brother when the mill closed down. Reggie lost his land when your father's company bought and stripped it. And me?" He paused, his voice lowering into a growl. "I lost everything, so today you will give it back." The words settled heavy in the room. The guests now understood this was not a random crime. It was personal. Clara closed her eyes, her tears freezing against her skin. Ethan shifted closer despite the ropes, his shoulder brushing hers. Even gagged, even helpless, his presence was an anchor. He leaned his head until their foreheads touched briefly, silently promising he would not let them break. In the flickering candlelight, the church no longer felt holy. The stained glass saints above looked down not with blessing but with sorrow, their colored light casting twisted shadows over the captives. The night outside grew colder, and the storm howled louder through the cracks of the old church walls. Inside, the captives waited, their breath shallow, their hearts racing as Victor's voice sealed their fate. "Pray, if you believe it helps. But know this: we are the gods of this night, and your lives rest on a ransom your family may or may not pay." And with those words, hope dimmed once more, leaving only the echo of fear in the ancient stones. The storm arrived with the suddenness of a blade drawn in darkness. Heavy snow began to descend on the quiet outskirts of Coldridge, swallowing roads, fences, and rooftops in sheets of white. The wind shrieked down the narrow streets like a chorus of restless spirits, slamming shutters against old wooden houses and making the town's lamps flicker. By the time the masked men inside the church were tightening their plans, the outside world had become a labyrinth of snowdrifts and swirling ice. The ancient stone church, isolated on its hill, seemed swallowed by night itself, its stained glass now darkened, only a faint flicker of candlelight betraying the horror within. Among the guests forced to the ground, one man had not given up his fight. Peter Callahan, a lanky accountant in his late 30s and a distant cousin of Clara, had always been overlooked in family gatherings. He had thinning hair, the color of damp straw, and wire-framed glasses that constantly slid down his nose. His shoulders sloped as though he bore invisible burdens, and he often stammered when speaking in front of others. But tonight, desperation granted him a strength no one expected. As Mason turned his back, Peter pressed his bound wrists against the jagged edge of a broken pew. The coarse rope bit into his skin, drawing blood, but he bit down on his gag to stifle his groan. Slowly, agonizingly, the strands began to fray. When the ropes finally gave way, Peter glanced toward Aunt Margaret, who was kneeling only a few feet away. Her eyes widened with sudden hope, but he pressed a finger to his lips. He crawled low across the stone floor, his heart hammering against his ribs, his glasses fogging with each terrified breath. The storm's howl outside muffled the faint sound of his movements. When Mason barked at Kyle for fumbling again with a knot, Peter seized his chance. He slipped toward a side door half hidden in the shadows of the nave, a door that led to the storage room. His body brushed against the cold wall, his every nerve screaming that a gunshot would end him. But somehow, mercifully, he passed unseen. The side door creaked only slightly as he forced it open, and the blizzard's fury rushed in to embrace him. Snow slapped his face, the cold biting deep into his skin. He stumbled forward into the storm, gasping through his gag until he ripped it away. The church's looming shadow vanished behind the curtain of snow as Peter half ran, half fell down the hill. His lungs burned, his hands raw and bleeding, but his mind screamed one thing: find help. 2 miles away, headlights cut through the swirling storm on a lonely stretch of road. Officer Luke Brennan guided his patrol SUV carefully over the snowbound trail. At 42, Luke was a man carved by grief and responsibility. His face was rugged, its sharp planes weathered by years of hardship, with lines that told of sleepless nights and burdens carried alone. His dark brown hair was trimmed short, streaked with silver at the temples, and his storm-gray eyes never fully softened, not even when he smiled, which had become a rare event. His once strong laughter lines had stiffened into grooves of sorrow after tragedy struck 3 years ago, when his young son Caleb had slipped beneath the ice of Lake Mercer before Luke could reach him. That failure, though no one blamed him, had carved a hollow inside his chest that no season had managed to thaw. Beside him sat Hunter, his 6-year-old German shepherd partner. Hunter was lean and muscular, with thick black and tan fur dusted by the frost clinging to the air vents. A long scar slashed across his right hip, the trophy of a landslide rescue mission that nearly claimed his life 2 years earlier. His amber eyes were sharp and restless, constantly scanning the snow-swept woods as though deciphering secrets in the wind. Hunter carried himself with quiet dignity, loyal to Luke, with a bond forged not only by training but by countless missions where his instincts had saved lives when technology failed. Luke drove in silence, one hand gripping the wheel, the other wrapped around a thermos of black coffee that had long gone cold. The radio hissed softly, the occasional crackle of static competing with the howl of the storm outside. It was another lonely patrol, another night where the world seemed drowned in snow and silence. He glanced at Hunter, who stared intently out the windshield, ears pricked. Luke muttered, "Long night ahead, buddy." The dog thumped his tail once against the seat, eyes never leaving the horizon. Then, through the storm, a figure stumbled into the road, flailing arms illuminated by the SUV's headlights. Luke slammed the brakes, the tires crunching against packed snow as the vehicle skidded to a halt. Hunter barked sharply, a low, guttural warning. Luke's heart lurched as he recognized the man. Bleeding wrists, torn suit, glasses askew, collapsing onto the snow with a strangled cry. Luke was out of the SUV in seconds, snow biting into his face, boots sinking into drifts. He crouched beside the man, lifting him upright. "Easy, easy. What happened?" Peter Callahan's lips trembled, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Church. The church. Masked men. They've got them all." His words spilled out, broken, frantic. "Ethan, Clara, everyone. Tied, gagged. They want money. They said ransom. You have to—" He coughed violently, nearly choking on the icy air. Luke's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face rigid as stone. His storm-gray eyes darkened with a familiar shadow. A church, a wedding, hostages. It was no longer an ordinary patrol. He could almost hear Caleb's laughter in the back of his mind, a cruel echo reminding him of the lives he couldn't save. But this time would be different. He wouldn't be too late again. He pulled Peter gently toward the SUV, bundling him into the back seat, and grabbed the radio mic. His voice was steady, clipped, every word carrying the weight of urgency. "Dispatch, this is Officer Brennan. I've got a code red at St. Helena's Church. Multiple hostages. Masked, armed suspects demanding ransom. I need immediate backup. Repeat, immediate backup." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static, urgent yet calm. "Copy that, Officer Brennan. Units will be en route. Proceed with caution until backup arrives." Luke replaced the mic, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the swirling storm beyond the windshield. He reached down, resting a gloved hand briefly on Hunter's strong neck. "We've got work to do, partner." The dog's ears flicked, and he let out a sharp, eager bark, as if affirming the mission. Luke's heart pounded, not from fear but from grim resolve. He turned to Peter, who shivered violently under his torn suit jacket. "Stay put. Keep your head down. You've done enough. You saved them more than you know." Peter nodded weakly, his glasses fogging as tears mixed with melted snow on his cheeks. The storm raged on, cloaking the church in white silence. Luke shifted the SUV into gear, eyes fixed ahead. As the words "church" echoed again in his mind, something inside him hardened. He knew churches were meant to be sanctuaries, safe from the evils of the world. But tonight, one had been defiled, its altar turned into a stage for cruelty. He would not let that stand. And so, with Hunter poised at his side and the storm howling like a herald of war, Luke Brennan drove into the night, knowing this was no small matter. It was the kind of battle that would test every scar, every regret, and every ounce of courage he still possessed. Snow still fell in thick, relentless sheets, draping the pine forest in a suffocating white silence. The road toward St. Helena's Church had disappeared under drifts so deep that Luke Brennan was forced to leave his SUV behind half a mile down the trail. His boots crunched against frozen ground, each step careful and deliberate, the sound quickly swallowed by the storm. Beside him, Hunter moved with feline grace despite his size, his black and tan fur speckled with falling snow, his amber eyes gleaming like lanterns against the dark. His tail was stiff, his nose twitching constantly as he read scents invisible to human senses. The old church rose ahead, its silhouette a jagged shadow against the white fury of the storm. Its tall spire pierced the sky like a dagger, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The stained glass windows glowed faintly from within, candlelight flickering in distorted colors, reds and yellows rippling across the snow. Yet there was no music, no hymn, no laughter. The silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional crash of branches under the weight of snow. Luke crouched low near a cluster of trees, studying the building. His storm-gray eyes scanned every angle, the years of training as a patrol officer and SWAT backup sharpening his instincts. He noticed faint impressions near the entrance. Footprints partially covered by snow, larger than a woman's shoe, the stride purposeful and heavy. He leaned closer and brushed away the top layer of frost. Blood. Just a faint smear on the stone. Hunter lowered his head, sniffed, and gave a quiet growl that vibrated deep in his chest. Luke whispered, "I know, boy. They're still inside." Moving closer, Luke let his hand rest lightly on the grip of his sidearm. His body was taut with focus, but he carried not the rashness of youth, but the grim patience of a man scarred by regret. He knew a misstep here could mean more death, and failure was something he could not bear. Not again. Hunter crept beside him, body low, ears pricked forward. From within the church, faint voices floated through the storm. Luke froze, pressing his back against the stone wall. He tilted his head, straining to listen. At first it was muffled, indistinct. Then he heard it. A sob, sharp and muffled. "Clara!" Her voice cracked with fear, the gag distorting her cries. His chest tightened, memories of Caleb's final cry clawing through him. But then another sound followed, the gravelly bark of command. Victor's voice, the leader of the kidnappers, deep and cutting, threatening her with words Luke could not yet make out. Luke's jaw clenched. He pressed one gloved hand against the heavy wooden door of the church. Its iron hinges groaned faintly, as if protesting his touch. He leaned close, his ear against the wood. Inside, Mason's high-pitched laugh echoed like broken glass. He could hear Kyle stammering nervously in response, and Victor snapping at them both. The scene painted itself clearly in Luke's mind. A bride weeping, a groom bound but furious, guests cowering while men played at gods. The storm surged, rattling the church's windows, masking Luke's movements as he slipped into the shadows near the side entrance. The smaller door here was warped from age, the paint peeling to reveal splintering wood. Luke crouched, examining it with practiced precision. The latch was old, crude, nothing a steady shoulder couldn't break, but brute force would bring chaos too early. He exhaled slowly, thinking. Hunter pressed close to him, ears flicking as if catching something Luke could not hear. The dog's nose lifted, then swung sharply toward the seams of the door. He let out a low, warning bark, so soft it was barely audible. Luke knelt, brushing gloved fingers along the gap beneath the frame. His fingertips came back, sticky. Rope fibers, fresh, torn strands with specks of blood. Someone had been dragged through here earlier. He whispered, "That's how the one got out." He thought of Peter Callahan, trembling in the back of his SUV, shivering as he recounted his escape. Now it all connected. This was the door of his salvation, and perhaps the key to Luke's entry. The church loomed above him, oppressive, its stained glass saints gazing blindly into the storm. Luke took a moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs, steadying his heartbeat. He felt the weight of his revolver, the familiar leather of the holster pressing against his side. Then he glanced at Hunter. The German shepherd's eyes were locked on him, unwavering, a silent question shining in their amber depths. Luke gave the faintest nod. He slipped his shoulder against the door, testing its give. Inside, Victor's voice rose again, more distinct now. "Quiet that woman or I'll end it here and now." Clara's sobbing turned into a strangled whimper. Ethan's muffled roar of defiance followed, only to be silenced by a brutal blow. Luke felt the anger rise like fire in his veins, but he smothered it. Patience, precision, and timing. Those would save lives, not rage. Hunter shifted, placing one paw lightly on the door, then glancing up at Luke as if to remind him that the time for hesitation was ending. Luke inhaled deeply, pressed his ear to the door one last time, and listened to the cadence of the voices, their movements, their distance from the altar. Then, cloaked by the storm's howl, he whispered to his partner, "Stay close, silent." The dog crouched lower, ready, every muscle taut with restrained energy. And with that, Luke Brennan prepared to enter the house of God that had been twisted into a chamber of cruelty, the cries of the bride echoing in his ears, and the storm outside seeming to rage in furious sympathy. The side door creaked open under Luke's steady push, and the storm outside seemed to hold its breath as he and Hunter slipped inside the ancient church. The air within was warmer, but heavy with fear, scented with sweat, candle wax, and the metallic tang of blood. Shadows flickered wildly across the stone walls as flames trembled in their sconces. Every sound inside was amplified, the scrape of boots, the whimper of terrified hostages, the harsh command of men who thought themselves in control. Hunter tensed at Luke's side, ears pricked forward, every muscle coiled like a spring. The German shepherd's amber eyes locked on the figures at the altar, and the low rumble of a growl vibrated through his chest. Luke lifted his pistol, his storm-gray eyes narrowing with the precision of a man who had done this before, who had lost too much to ever allow hesitation again. The scene unfolded in chaos and cruelty. Ethan and Clara were still bound, their faces pale, their lips raw from the gags. Clara's cheeks glistened with tears, her chest rising and falling rapidly under the torn lace of her wedding gown. Ethan's dark eyes were filled with rage, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might crack. Around them, the guests knelt in clusters, Aunt Margaret clutching her rosary until her knuckles turned white. David's body tensed like a drawn bow, his face swollen from a blow delivered earlier. Victor, the scar-faced leader, stood tall at the altar, his broad shoulders casting long shadows on the wall behind him. He barked orders in his gravelly voice, gesturing sharply for Mason to check the bindings again. Mason, thin and twitchy, grinned like a man enjoying a grotesque play. Reggie lingered by the main doors, his shotgun steady, eyes pale and hollow, scanning the room with the patience of a soldier trained never to blink. Kyle, the youngest, shuffled nervously at the edge of the group, his freckled face tight with doubt, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the rope that bound Father Joseph. Then it happened. Hunter surged forward from the shadows like a storm unleashed, his paws striking the stone floor with thunderous speed. His bark exploded through the silence, sharp and furious, ricocheting against the vaulted ceiling until it sounded like a chorus of angels crying out. The kidnappers whirled in shock, Mason's smirk vanishing, Reggie's shotgun rising too late. Luke burst in behind his partner, his pistol raised, his voice carrying the authority of both law and a man unwilling to lose another life. "Police, drop your weapons!" His shout rang with such force that even the flames seemed to hesitate. The sanctuary erupted into pandemonium. Victor spun, eyes blazing, his scar twisting into a snarl. "Shoot him!" he roared. Mason lunged for his pistol, but his hand trembled under Hunter's savage bark. It was Kyle who broke first. The young man gasped, stumbling backward, his rope slipping from his hands as panic overtook him. His freckles stood out starkly against his pale skin, his eyes wide as a trapped animal. For a heartbeat, he looked less like a criminal and more like a frightened boy who had followed the wrong men into hell. But Mason, desperate to regain control, snatched Clara from the floor, yanking her upright with brutal force. Her veil fell away, her hair tumbling in tangled waves over her shoulders as she cried out in terror. Mason pressed a knife to her throat. the blade glinting in the candlelight. "Back off, cop! One step closer and I slit her open!" he shrieked, his voice high, manic. Luke froze, every instinct screaming to fire, but every calculation demanding patience. His finger tightened on the trigger, but his storm-gray eyes flicked to Hunter. The German shepherd had dropped low, muscles taut, lips peeled back to reveal sharp teeth. His growl was low, deliberate, a warning meant only for the man holding Clara. Victor roared again. "Hold her steady, Mason!" But the tremor in Mason's hand betrayed his fear. Clara's pale blue eyes locked on Luke's across the room, wide and desperate, pleading without words. Ethan thrashed against his ropes, muffled cries breaking through the gag as his wife's life hung by a thread. Hunter saw the hesitation, the weakness in Mason's grip, and moved like lightning. With a feral snarl, he lunged, his jaws clamping onto Mason's forearm. The knife clattered to the floor, sparks flying as steel struck stone. Mason screamed, his thin body buckling under the sudden weight and fury of the German shepherd. Blood sprayed across the aisle, staining the bride's gown in crimson streaks. Clara stumbled free, falling into Ethan's arms. Though bound, Ethan twisted his body to shield her, his dark eyes blazing with both relief and fury. The sanctuary became a storm. Victor fired his pistol, the deafening crack echoing through the nave. Luke ducked behind a pew, returning fire with calm precision. Splinters flew as bullets chewed into the wooden benches. Reggie moved toward the center aisle, his shotgun raised, his gaunt face unflinching. Luke pivoted, fired twice, forcing him to dive for cover behind a marble column. Kyle stood frozen, his rope limp in his hands, his freckled face twisted, torn between loyalty to Victor and the terror of becoming a murderer. Aunt Margaret's eyes locked onto his, silently begging him to choose differently. Kyle's lips parted, but no words came. Hunter refused to let go. His jaws clamped tighter around Mason's arm, dragging the man down. Mason's screams filled the sanctuary, wild and ragged, his twitchy frame thrashing on the stone floor. Victor cursed, firing again, bullets sparking against the altar steps. Luke advanced, rolling from cover to cover, his body moving with the precision of training and the desperation of a man who could not afford another failure. The hostages wept, their cries blending with the chaos. Clara clung to Ethan, burying her, face against his shoulder as Hunter growled over Mason's broken shrieks. The clash of law and lawlessness, of vows and violence, echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling like a judgment pronounced by heaven itself. And above it all, the bells of the church began to toll again, shaken by the storm outside. Their iron voices rang through the chaos, each chime a reminder of sacred promises and shattered peace. The sound rolled across the night, carrying with it a message to all who heard. A reckoning had begun within the sanctuary. The gunfire had ceased, but the echoes still clung to the stone walls like restless spirits. Smoke from discharged weapons drifted upward, mingling with the candlelight and creating a haze that blurred the stained glass above. Hunter stood guard over Mason, whose twitching frame writhed in pain, his arm mauled and bleeding where the German shepherd's jaws had clamped down. Clara huddled against Ethan, trembling, her gown streaked with dirt and blood but her body intact. The hostages murmured prayers of relief, though their wrists remained bound. For the first time in hours, the kidnappers were not in control. Victor lay sprawled against the altar steps, his broad chest heaving. His pistol had been knocked from his hand, and blood seeped slowly from a graze across his shoulder where Luke's bullet had found him. Even wounded, his scarred face twisted in a defiant sneer. His dark eyes, filled with hate, followed Luke's every move as the officer swept the sanctuary, gun steady, ensuring no one else rose to strike. Reggie had dropped his shotgun after a brutal kick from Luke that had sent the weapon clattering into the pews. He now sat hunched against a column, his gaunt face impassive, but his pale eyes watchful. Kyle, the youngest, had collapsed against the wall, hands raised, his freckled skin blotchy with shame and fear. Luke moved with grim precision, his storm-gray eyes scanning, his finger still on the trigger. Only when he was sure the danger was contained did he step forward toward Victor. Hunter padded beside him, every muscle tense, his lips curled just enough to keep the scarred man cautious. Luke crouched, pressing one gloved hand firmly against Victor's chest to keep him down. "It's over," Luke said, his voice flat, the authority of law and loss woven together. Victor chuckled bitterly, his breath ragged. "You think this ends here? You think this was just about a bag of money?" He spat blood to the side, his words sharp even in weakness. Luke's eyes narrowed. He searched Victor's coat for weapons, his hand slipping into an inner pocket. There, folded tight and worn at the creases, he found a letter. The envelope was smudged, the paper stiff with age and grime. Luke tore it open carefully, his brows furrowing as he scanned the words. The handwriting was jagged, pressed with fury, and though the sentences were crude, their meaning was clear. This is not ransom alone. This is vengeance for every contract stolen, every family ruined by Whitmore greed. The daughter's wedding will pay the debt her father never did. Luke exhaled slowly, his chest heavy. He turned the page toward the faint light of the candles. Attached at the bottom was a copy of an old contract, bearing the name of Charles Whitmore, Clara's late father. It detailed the acquisition of a lumber yard a decade ago, one that had shut down after being absorbed into Whitmore Industries. Entire families had been put out of work. Among them were men like Mason and Reggie, whose bitterness had festered into violence, and Victor, who had lost not only his livelihood but his brother during the protests that followed the mill's closure. Clara's eyes widened as Luke read the words aloud. Her lips parted in shock, tears spilling fresh down her pale cheeks. "My father," she whispered. "He never told me. He never—" Ethan shifted closer, his jaw tight, his body shielding her even as his own fury simmered. The truth was not her fault, but the sins of the past had been written into her wedding day like a curse. Reggie's hollow voice cut through the silence. "He's right." He leaned his gaunt head back against the column, his eyes empty. "Your father's company stripped the land bare. My farm, gone. My wife left when we couldn't feed the children. Mason lost his brother in the riot at the gates. And Victor—" His voice trailed off, but the hatred in his glance toward Clara said the rest. Mason, still bleeding on the floor, let out a manic laugh, though it cracked into a wheeze. "We planned this for years, not just for cash, for justice, and we would have had it if not for this mutt." He spat toward Hunter, who growled deeply, his hackles rising. Kyle's voice trembled as he finally spoke, his face flushed with shame. "I didn't know." His freckled skin shone with sweat. "They told me it was just money, that nobody would get hurt. I thought—" He stopped, his voice breaking. His youth was laid bare, the image of a boy who had stumbled into darkness without realizing how deep it went. Luke's jaw hardened as he folded the letter and slipped it into an evidence bag. His storm-gray eyes flicked across each man, seeing not just criminals, but shattered lives twisted by bitterness. Yet none of it excused the terror inflicted on innocent people. He glanced at Clara, her tears streaking her pale cheeks, and Ethan, whose dark eyes burned with both rage and relief. "This wasn't just a crime," Luke muttered. "This was war carried from the past into the present." Victor sneered, his voice low and venomous. Your badge can't change the truth, officer. Men like us were broken by men like him. And tonight, the world was supposed to see it. Luke leaned closer, his voice steady but sharp as ice. All the world will see is that you took a church full of innocents hostage. Whatever truth you carried burned away the moment you put that knife to a bride's throat. Hunter barked once, loud and commanding, as if to punctuate his handler's words. Outside, the storm howled louder, rattling the stained glass windows until they groaned in protest. The bells overhead swayed with the wind, their hollow tolling echoing like a dirge. Inside, the hostages wept quietly, some whispering prayers of thanks, others trembling as the reality of what had almost happened sank into their bones. Luke stood tall again, his figure a pillar against the flickering shadows. He holstered, his weapon, his eyes never leaving Victor, who now slumped in defeat, but whose hatred had not dimmed. "You'll answer for this," Luke said quietly. "In a court of law, not with blood." As backup sirens wailed faintly in the distance, winding through the storm, Luke turned to Clara and Ethan. He crouched, his voice softening for the first time since the chaos began. "It's over. For now. You're safe." Clara pressed her face into Ethan's shoulder, sobbing with relief. Ethan looked at Luke, his jaw unclenching, his eyes speaking gratitude words could not carry. Luke rose once more, the evidence of vengeance clutched in his hand. He knew the case was larger than ransom, larger even than this single night. It was a wound festering from choices made long ago. But tonight, the wound had been exposed, and the truth behind the plot would echo far beyond the frozen walls of St. Helena's Church. The sirens grew louder, weaving through the storm like distant cries of salvation, until the red and blue lights spilled across the snow outside St. Helena's Church. The storm was still raging, but its fury was beginning to tire, the flakes falling slower, softer, as if heaven itself exhaled relief. Inside the ancient stone walls, silence hung heavy for a moment before it cracked open into something else. An eruption of sobs, gasps, and the trembling laughter of people who had survived what they thought would be their final night. Clara clung to Ethan, her slender body shaking as though every sob was torn from the depths of her soul. Her hair, once perfectly arranged beneath the bridal veil, was now a wild halo of chestnut strands, sticking damply to her pale cheeks. Her blue eyes, red from crying, shone with the raw brilliance of a woman who had been dragged to the edge of despair and pulled back by a miracle. Ethan wrapped his broad arms around her, holding her against his chest with a desperation that matched his own relief. His suit was torn, his wrists raw from rope, but his dark eyes were alive with gratitude and unyielding love. Hunter slumped nearby, his chest rising and falling heavily, steam puffing from his muzzle with each labored breath. His fur was soaked with blood, not his own, but the crimson of the man who had threatened Clara. Yet his amber eyes glowed fiercely, unwavering in their devotion. When Clara's trembling hand reached out to stroke his head, Hunter's tail thumped weakly against the stone floor, a tired but triumphant acknowledgement of her touch. The guests, though bound, began to weep with relief. Aunt Margaret lifted her rosary with trembling hands, her frail shoulders shaking as she whispered a prayer of thanks, her silver hair matted against her wrinkled face. David, bruised but alive, laughed through tears as he leaned against the pew, his sandy hair damp with sweat. Father Joseph, his cassock torn, rose slowly from his knees, his lined face radiant with awe as he looked toward the officer and the dog who had become instruments of deliverance. Luke stood at the center of it all, his storm-gray eyes scanning the sanctuary one last time, ensuring no threat remained. For a moment, his chest felt heavy with memory, Caleb's name still whispered in the deepest corner of his grief. But now, something within him shifted. He saw Clara alive, Ethan clutching her as though he would never let go, Hunter triumphant though weary. And in that sight, Luke felt the ice inside his chest begin to thaw. He holstered his weapon, his broad shoulders sagging with relief, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The main doors of the church burst open, snow blowing in as backup officers stormed inside. The first among them was Sergeant Maria Torres, a woman in her late 30s, short but formidable, with a frame built by years of patrol work and the confidence of someone who had wrestled order from chaos many times before. Her dark hair was cut into a sharp bob, framing a face with high cheekbones and determined brown eyes. She carried herself with authority, but her voice was steady and kind as she called, "Everyone, stay calm. We've got you now." Behind her came paramedics, young men and women wrapped in heavy jackets, carrying kits that smelled faintly of antiseptic. One of them, a tall medic with ginger hair and freckles across his pale face, moved quickly to Mason, who still writhed on the floor, his screams ragged and broken. Another paramedic rushed to Clara, kneeling beside her with gentle hands, though Ethan's protective presence loomed as if he would not allow anyone near her without trust. Clara, still trembling, nodded weakly, and the medic checked her pulse, murmuring soft reassurances. Maria Torres strode toward Luke, her boots clicking sharply on the stone floor. "Brennan," she said, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and frustration, "you really couldn't wait for backup, could you?" Luke gave a weary shrug, his jaw tightening, but the faintest trace of a smile flickered across his weathered face. "There wasn't time." Torres exhaled, shaking her head, but her eyes softened. "Well, thank God for that dog of yours." She crouched and reached a hand toward Hunter, who looked up, ears twitching, before letting his head rest back down. "He's earned steak dinners for the rest of his life," Torres murmured. Outside, the storm began to break. Through the cracked, stained glass, faint moonlight seeped in, mixing with the flashing lights of squad cars and ambulances. The once terrifying church now seemed transformed, its arches no longer cloaked in dread, but shimmering with fragile hope. As the hostages were freed, ropes cut and wounds tended, the sanctuary filled with the strange music of both weeping and laughter. Margaret kissed Clara's forehead, whispering, "Your father's sins are not your own, my dear." David clapped Ethan on the shoulder, both men exchanging the kind of look shared only by those who had walked through fire together. Father Joseph raised his voice, his deep baritone trembling as he prayed aloud. In darkness, the light was not overcome. In fear, faith stood firm. Luke stood apart, watching. He felt the pull of solitude even in the crowd, his grief never far. Yet, as Hunter nudged his leg, pressing close, Luke realized he was no longer entirely alone. He knelt, his gloved hand stroking the dog's damp fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking just slightly. "You saved more than them tonight." The storm outside eased into silence, the bells swaying gently in the tower, as if marking the end of suffering. Snow still blanketed the ground, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt clean, renewed, as though the night had been baptized in both fear and deliverance. For Ethan and Clara, the day that began as a nightmare became etched forever as something else. Their wedding had been desecrated, their joy nearly stolen, but what remained was stronger than vows alone. It was the proof that love can endure terror, that loyalty can stand against cruelty, and that sometimes angels arrive on 4 legs, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. And for Luke Brennan, as he watched the rescued embrace beneath the shattered glow of stained glass, he felt for the first time in years, that the world still held space for light. His storm-gray eyes lifted to the vaulted ceiling, and for a fleeting moment he thought he could hear Caleb's laughter again, carried in the fading howl of the wind. The night was not just survival. It was a miracle after the storm. In the silence after the storm, what remained inside that old church was more than survival. It was proof that when darkness presses in, God's light can still break through. The loyalty of a dog, the courage of an officer, and the power of love became instruments of His grace, a living reminder that miracles are not always thunder from the heavens. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on four paws, in a steady hand, or in the simple act of choosing love over fear. In our daily lives, we may not face masked men or raging storms, but we all carry struggles, moments when hope feels bound and gagged within us. This story reminds us that no matter how heavy the night may seem, God can send us help in unexpected ways. Faith, loyalty, and love are the threads He uses to weave miracles into ordinary days. If this story touched your heart, share it so others may find hope. Comment below where you're watching from, and let your voice be part of this community of faith and courage. Don't forget to subscribe so these stories of love, redemption, and second chances continue to reach more people. May God bless you and your loved ones, today and always. Amen.